Welcome to Political Therapy. I am your host, Nicholas Villa. Political Therapy is an online radio program focused on explaining politics and healing society. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Once again, welcome to Political Therapy. Nicholas Villa, streaming from Bogota, Colombia. Today's episode is a must-listen because of my two very special guests. One, of course, needs no introduction, Todd McGowan, and the other is also a good friend of mine, philosopher Tomas Molina. The subject is in the title of the episode, so we'll get right to the interview. But first, I want to send a greeting and a big thank you to our expanding international audience by mentioning all the countries where Political Therapy has listeners. We're proud to have listeners from Colombia, the US, Austria, the Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, India, South Africa, Czech Republic, Ireland, Turkey, UK, Canada, Brazil, and Switzerland. So thank you, girls and guys, for making this a very special time for me as a host, as a human being, and even as an internationalist. I know the troubles between happiness and psychoanalysis, but nonetheless, what the hell, I'm happy. I also want to mention Ramtim Arab-Louis, host of NPR podcast Throughline, for his kind mention of political therapy. For me, Throughline is one of the reasons why I even do podcasts. So thanks a lot, Ramtim. And now, here are our guests, Todd and Tomas.
Once again, welcome to Political Therapy. It's an online podcast. Today, I have the great pleasure of having two good friends on the show. Of course, we have Mr. Todd McGowan, well-renowned intellectual and great friend of the show. Thank you very much for being here today.
It's absolutely my pleasure.
Thank you, Todd. And my good friend Tomas Molina, whom people already know as well.
I'm not a renowned intellectual.
Yes, a renowned intellectual, professor as well, and a PhD in philosophy. And I'm very honored to have you both on the show. So welcome, first of all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And second of all, I'll introduce the subject, which is the current political climate in the United States, which I think is quite interesting. There are interesting things happening in the U.S. We've had both conventions by now, both major party conventions by now, and the reason that I also think it's very pertinent to speak about the U.S. is because I recently read a book by Isabel Wilkerson that discusses the topic of caste in the U.S. Not class, but caste. And I found it extremely interesting because she basically says, yes, there's an issue of class, of course, but that's only an issue that pertains to the dominant caste. There's a lower caste that she deems, African Americans, blacks, whatever. And she says that, that lower caste can't ever get out of that caste. She says class is something you can somehow overcome. You can move between classes, but you can't move between castes. And she gives examples of NBA players, actor Forrest Whitaker, yeah, and NBA, NFL, and she says whatever they do, they can't get out of that caste. And I find it very interesting because she goes on to say that there's a new, or the only place where, let's say, poor white people have actually decreased their standard of living and their life expectancy is in the U.S.
Right.
At the same time, where even this lower caste that she calls black people, and she actually, there are many minorities in the U.S., but she speaks specifically about black people, have actually more life expectancy. No, theirs is increasing, and the only place in the world where their white people's or poor white people's life expectancy is decreasing is in the U.S. So this explains, in a way, this whole Trump phenomenon. According to her, or I think she implies that, which I find completely interesting. You have these two concepts overlapping, caste and class. And I thought, okay, well, this is a great time to call my favorite analysts. So, so please, guys, what do you consider is happening at the moment?
Tomas, you want to start or?
No, you should start.
Okay. Well, I think I really like this analysis, but I think that I think you have to understand the relationship between racism and class oppression always together, right? Like, I think that's one of the, it's not, I find it interesting that there was no really, there was prejudice, of course, but prior to the onset of capitalist modernity, there wasn't racism in the way that we understand it now. So I think that you have to really think of racism as always entwined within capitalism. And one of the ways in which it's entwined is that it gives the poor whites who are in the capitalist system a reason for their oppression that is not tied to capitalism, right? So they see, the poor white sees blackness as the reason for the reason why they're down, the reason why their life expectancy is down, and then they have this figure that allows them to avoid being critical of the capitalist system. So it's, in other words, it's precisely the figure of blackness that allows one not to be a supporter of Bernie Sanders and to be a supporter of Donald Trump, right? So it takes this focus away from the larger capitalist structure and puts it on the racial dynamic that exists. So I think that, to me, is really interesting, the way in which capitalism really depends on racism, because, a conservative candidate in the US, if they didn't get a large portion of the poor white vote, would have absolutely no chance to win, right? So their platform basically the platform is, let's make it easier for big companies, let's cut regulation, cut taxes on the wealthy. That platform would have, it'd get maybe 20% of support from the people if you didn't have this racist add-on that attracts the poor white figure. So I think, to me, the way in which caste and class work together to keep the power structure as it's in the whole capitalist structure in place is absolutely essential to understanding what's going on. And I think it helps to make sense of Trump, right? Like if Trump didn't have that racist appeal, then I think he would have almost no support. And I think the conservative candidate has to be like Trump, because I don't think running just on a conservative platform, I think they would have I think their support would really bottom out. So I think it's an interesting phenomenon. And I think it's essential to think about racism in terms of the larger capitalist dynamic. And I think a lot of people are in America, but I think there's this tendency to think of it as this racism is one thing and then class oppression is another thing. But I think you have to see them as totally entwined and essential to keep the capitalist structure going.
Okay. Yeah, the caste structure, says Wilkerson, it modifies the lower caste's way of even assuming politics and life itself, as does or it has the same effect on the higher caste. and just along the lines of what you're saying, she goes on to say that pretty much these poor white people, all they have spiritually even is being above the lower caste, and that is just what you're saying. That's sort of their their spiritual anchor, and precisely what doesn't create a sort of clash or class struggle is the term in the US amongst the white segment of the population, whatever that is, because that's changed throughout history.
Right. Nicholas, I just have a question for you. So do you think that the poor whites feel superior, or do you think that they feel like their oppression is due to like blackness getting ahead of them, right? Like, I wonder which it is. Like, I think that historically there was an idea of superiority, but now that, like, among poor whites, they believe that racism occurs against them, and that because of programs like affirmative action, which they even to the extent that those exist anymore, they feel like there's all these black advantages over them. And so these protests, I think, are interpreted by a lot of poor whites. I don't mean to, not all of them, of course, but a lot of poor whites in the States as if they're another advantage that blackness has over them, right? So I think it's not just that they feel superior, it's also that they feel in some way oppressed.
Exactly. Because some, at least individuals of that caste, are advancing in life and are getting ahead in life and so on and so forth, then they feel precisely that their spiritual or their ontological and even social way of life is threatened. And I think that also explains a bit this whole opioid crisis and sort of the loss of path in life. But I don't know what
Nicholas. I want to point out something. In Democracy in America, Tocqueville says that, well, he comes from the Ancien Regime, right? I mean, he goes to America after the French Revolution, but he grew up in the Ancien Regime, and he points out something that's very interesting. He says that in the United States, the master-servant relationship is different because if you arrive in America, you can start as a servant, but if you work enough, according to Tocqueville, you can end up having a lot of money. So you'll have your own servants. So the master-servant relationship is not a relationship in which the servant considers himself a servant, like in essence, he thinks he'll end up having money. So he treats his master not like a master, but like, it's just a business relationship. That's Tocqueville's point. But in France, even after the French Revolution, servants thought that they were servants, basically. So they treated their masters like they were real masters. Because in France, you're a servant because your parents were servants and your grandparents were servants. So it was really a caste. That's where I want to go. It was a caste in France. So you thought of yourself as belonging to a caste, and so you didn't feel bad if you didn't become a master, because that's simply what you were. You were a servant, and that's it. But in the United States, I mean, from an ideological point of view, the big other is always telling you, hey, you can't stop being a servant. You can't end up having a lot of money, a mansion, all the luxuries of that capitalism offers you. And if you don't acquire all those things, you end up being a loser, which is a very American thing to, at least according to my perception, a very American thing to say. I don't think that in old European societies the concept of loser existed. because if you were a servant, that's it. You're a servant. And so Tocqueville points out, and he's not the only one to point this out, that in caste societies, the people who are in the bottom of the society don't think that they're actually losers. That's just the way things work. But in capitalism, people actually think of themselves as losers, precisely because there's always the option, according to the dominant ideology, of making a lot of money. So when you're talking about a caste in the United States, it makes me think that it's not the caste of old. It's not the caste of the ancien regime. It's a different type of caste because it pretends to be meritocratic, and at the same time, it pretends to be mobile in the sense that, like you yourself said, like in the class system, you can go up and you can go down, but the caste system still pretends it.
Wilkerson's point is precisely that only applies, what you're saying, if you're not black. Because she equates the American South, especially, with even an Indian and in India, the country, caste system, where you have a religious structure, this whole descendants of Canaan, the issue of endogamy, so you can't marry, whites and blacks can't marry, and they'd be punished if they would marry amongst themselves. The issue of purity. Whites and blacks can't share the same swimming pool because it'll be contaminated. The jobs that they can do, the tasks. So she argues that there are 8 pillars that somehow support that supported that caste structure, especially in the Jim Crow South. And today there are those remnants, right? So yeah, of course I agree with you, Tomas, but I also see Wilkerson's point that perhaps if your skin is a certain color in the US, then you really do think that you don't have any chances, despite if you have the mansion and the sports cars and and this
right.
social objective, you still belong to the lower caste. And I think that's her big point. And perhaps European men would not have, noticed it. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Tocqueville talks about master-servant relationship between whites. He's not talking about in this chapter, at least. I think it's in the second volume. He doesn't talk about, or I don't remember him talking about a master-slave relationship between whites and blacks.
And from that point, I would ask you guys, well, how can this affect this upcoming election? What are the implications? First, for maybe to know who might win or who has better chances, and second, if we accept this Wilkerson's point as valid, what can the left do there? Like what would a left-wing standpoint assume from this analysis?
Well, it seems to me like about the coming election, I think it's kind of a dire pronouncement, isn't it? Like I don't necessarily think that Trump's going to win, but I think he's still got such a large percentage of the vote, given how incompetently he's governed. It's really striking, right? Like he should lose by like a Hoover-esque. So Hoover lost like 60-40, so about like by 20 points. And you would expect that with Trump, given how poorly he's governed the coronavirus and just governed the country in whole. But I think I expect he'll lose, but only by like 5, like less, very small margin. And I think it's precisely because of this. But I also think the point about the challenge for the left is really good because, historically the left has been tied solely to class politics, right? And race has been epiphenomenal. Racism has been epiphenomenal. And I think now we're seeing almost a shift totally in the other direction, where the fundamentals, cultural, social, political injustice is racism, and class oppression is sort of pushed to the side. And I think that maybe this has historically been the challenge for the left throughout its history, but I think especially now, the challenge is to see the way in which the struggle against racism and the struggle against capitalism are really the same struggle. And I think that to me is I think Bernie, at least here in the U.S., says that a lot. And I think, to me, that's the crucial thing to see, because, all these Black Lives Matter protests, who wasn't at them was lower class whites, right? Okay. So a lot of upper class whites were there and middle class whites were there, but not a lot of lower class whites. And if you think about it, that's really the true universal position, is the bond between Black subjects and lower class white subjects, right? Because they're both in the same oppressed position fighting against the capitalist structure, but that's not who gets together. They're made to seem as if they're at odds with each other. And I think Trump brings that out better than anyone, and I think he capitalizes on that.
Yeah. How to cater to these, to this class. Yeah, go ahead, Tomas. I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to say that because of what Todd just said, I think that Trump supporters do think, lower class whites who support Trump think that blacks steal their enjoyment. Not only blacks, but liberals as well, for example. Whatever they think liberals are, they think that they're stealing their enjoyment. And they're preventing the United States of becoming a harmonious society. They're basically saying it out loud. If they didn't exist, if blacks didn't exist, if liberals didn't exist, the United States would be 100% harmonious society. And their hate towards them is precisely the hate, I would say, at least, of someone who thinks that the enemy, the other, is stealing their enjoyment and preventing them of becoming what they should become.
Yeah, I think that's I love that statement by Tomas. I totally agree with what he's saying. I think that's amazing. And I think, just to build on that, I think that to get out of that logic is really hard, because the idea that I think you get the most enjoyment from the idea that someone is stealing your enjoyment, right? Because you
precisely, exactly,
that proof of enjoyment. And so I feel like it's so hard to break the power of that, especially when you have no other life chances, right? Like, your life chances are so minimal. Just as you're saying, Tomas, as you were pointing out, this the way, or Nicholas, I forget who said this, but Nicholas, you were saying it, that the chances of the poor whites in the U.S. are going down, actually. When you're in that position, really, it's such a respite to have this idea of, I can see this, what's taking my enjoyment away, and I can enjoy that. I think that's just really, it's really tough to break the bond of that, and to see. And I think it's interesting. Tomas, when you said liberals, it's like, it's so this term. I don't know if you know this in Colombia, but do you know this term, the libtard?
Yeah.
I don't know.
So this is their favorite, the conservatives' favorite insult, and it's a combination of liberal and, excuse me for saying the word, but retard, right? Like So the libtard. I actually I live in Vermont, and I was driving through a neighborhood, and someone had pasted a bumper sticker on a sign that said, "Jesus was a libtard." And I thought, that was very nice. It was kind of a nice response. But I think the political correctness is a big thing, and it's tied to that idea of stealing enjoyment. Like, they don't let us even talk in the way that we want to be able to talk, and that's a clear way that liberals are stealing our enjoyment, I think. So yeah,
exactly, that's it.
Yeah,
which wasn't even enjoyable before the liberals started to forbid it, right?
No, it's a great point. Yeah, it's a great point. That saying like obscene or offensive things is completely not enjoyable unless there's a liberal there to say you can't do that.
Exactly.
Yeah, there are two things there that sort of come to my mind. The first is this political correctness, which is basically when you try to abolish subjective direct violence while you increase objective violence, to sort of, but also for me, it also seems like they're in this way, of having the combination of caste and class also does in some way validate American exceptionalism, because I can't think of other societies where Wilkerson says that, for example, in South Africa, the caste system was there, but then because the whites were a minority, you would have some sort of mixed races that would be the other castes, which is a bit what happens here in Colombia as well, because the sort of pure caste or superior caste is just physically a minority. Yeah. In the U.S., that doesn't happen. Whites are still majority. So in a way, I think that allows for precisely having this this phenomenon where you have caste and class existing at the same time, and it's exceptional. But for me, it's also revealing to explain the U.S. Because how then? Because are you going to cater to this white lower class higher caste, which is essential for any real change? And I'm sorry, here I introduced the question. Alain Berrieux would say that he never votes because he believes that liberal democracies are there to change governments but not society. Right? That's his argument. You'll have Hitler and you can have the extreme right wing get to power, but never communists. So what do you guys?
You can get communists, but the CIA will overthrow them.
Yeah, you can get them in Bolivia and Venezuela.
I was going to say.
Yeah. Being from Latin America, I question that right away. But But yeah. So, what do you guys think?
Well, I think the question of American exceptionalism around this, I think that's absolutely correct, and I think. The reason that America was allowed to be or could fashion itself as the land of opportunity is precisely because it had this permanent caste that everyone else was on top of. And so you could come and and a lot of African American thinkers have talked about this moment which you become white when you come to America. Like you just feel like you're whatever, Irish, Spanish, whatever. And then you come to America and you all of a sudden think, I see now I'm white, I'm not black, right? So white just meant not black. And what's interesting is, there's these people that talk about the coming Democratic majority because America's about to become less than 50% white, right? So this whole, but the problem is that Latinas increasingly think of themselves as white. So there's this, there's this way in which this minority majority thing might never happen because people will, as long as you're not black, you can consider yourself part of the white majority, right? So there's always the possibility for that kind of slippage. So I think I think that is essential to the idea of American exceptionalism. I think it's the privileged role of racism within American society that has allowed it to be this quote unquote land of opportunity for all the whites that come. And also all Latinos and Latinas that come too, because I think they can assimilate into the white majority in a way that if you're black, you can't do. So
exactly.
That's especially tragic because, African Americans were the only one who never even wanted to come in the first place, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and that's been sort of the history of the U.S. Each newcomer eventually seems to assimilate whiteness. And I don't know, being from a Catholic, background and so on, and Latin American, it seems like when I've been to countries that are Protestant, whatever, I find this culture of hazing, that you sort of have to go through some rituals so you eventually become part of. I find integration in the U.S. like along those lines. I don't know what you guys think, but
Nicholas, but I want to ask you a question because you lived in the United States when you were little. And I wanted to know if I guess you were just a child, so you didn't have a clear idea about your identity. But what was your identity while you grew up in the United States? Because I've only been in the United States as a tourist, like for a week, and so I don't know.
That's a harsh question. Personal questions are harsh, Tomas. But what I remember I lived most of the time in the suburbs in Pennsylvania, and on the questions of race that sometimes did come up, I would get questions like, why do you speak with an accent? Like, you should get rid of it, like, but as if it was a choice. Like, why do you, continue to speak with an accent? And I also had.
But you were speaking with an accent on purpose.
Well,
to a certain extent.
No, this is just the way I speak. I don't know, man. I should speak like this. And once I was also asked, but yeah, and here there was, direct racism. Like, I would do well in school, so they would ask, people would ask me, well, if you, the statement was, you're bright, like you do well, so you're white, right? Like, but it was in the form of a question. You're white, right? Like, you do well in school, so you're white. I was like, well,
but you were good at sports, so you were Latino.
Yeah, I was good at soccer. Yeah. But then the thing is that soccer in the U.S. is very, or at least what I experienced, is connected to some sort of like cosmopolitan, urban sort of mindset. Like, the kids who played soccer would eventually, the white kids who played soccer would eventually go into private schools and so on. And yeah, later on I would know that it's because there's this association between soccer and cosmopolitanism and so on. Yeah. But yeah, so they would wear a tie and all this. But yeah, at the time I didn't know. But it's strange. I always felt in the U.S., and because I knew I would eventually come back, that I felt like a foreigner. Like, I never managed to feel, like. But that's also my personality, and that's just my stuff. But today, yeah, it's different. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Personal questions are difficult. I don't know.
Right, but because I ask you because what Todd is saying is actually something that's very relevant to the discussion. Because if Latinos are starting to consider themselves white, that changes the whole equation. Like Todd says, maybe the whites are not gonna be a minority after all. Because if the only requisite to be considered white is not being black, well, even Asians can become white, and probably or Indians. I don't know.
I think that's
if it's only a matter.
Sort of, yeah.
But I think that reveals precisely that it's never been about race. About biology, because from a biological point of view, that it doesn't make sense. It's always been about other things, and you can actually see that more clearly in the case of colonial South America, because here, if you were a black slave and you bought your freedom, you could actually buy what they called gracias al sacar, which means that you could buy your whiteness. I don't know if Todd knows this, but you could buy your whiteness. You could say to the viceroy, "Hey, I want to become white," and the viceroy would say, "Hey, all right, pay me, I don't know, this amount of money, and I'll give you a certificate which says that you're white, and so you'll have all the privilege, all the legal privileges of whiteness. So you can sit down in the front row of the church. You can be exempt of some taxes, etc. But it was just a legal document, and you were considered white.
Yeah,
it's never been about race.
There were already Inca nobles, right, who sort of had treaties with the Spanish crown, and they would already have, today I think their descendants live in Madrid, actually, because, they did. But yeah, now on the issue of, Latin Americans, for example, Cubans, I think they were always considered white, basically. They had their own, so do we sit at the back of the bus, or what do we do? And yeah.
Right.
At the same time, Mexican immigrants, we have this whole border issue and the wall. Right. So yeah, it's everywhere. I don't know.
Right. Cubans, I think it's no secret why they vote. They're typically conservative voters, right? Because of this, like more assimilation into whiteness. I think that's exactly why that happens. But it's interesting that it does suggest. I think it's right to think And I think it's interesting how easy it is for people to fall back into thinking that race is something when it's really, I mean, and I think the best way to think about it is to think that it's always racism that produces race. So whenever you see race, you have to think racism. You have to think that somewhere racism is operative in so far as it makes me see race at all. And I think that's something that I think people fail to do that a lot. And I think and I think the way in which people, this notion of buying whiteness, I think just so shows that, doesn't it? It makes clear that all it is a category that's used in some kind of political, social dynamic, right? I think often to create enjoyment for a certain group of people, right? Like I think that's one of the main ways in which it's used.
Going back to the question of elections and liberal democracy, do you vote, Todd? Do you vote?
I do vote. Yeah. I vote. I kind of am a believer in democracy against. I know Badu and of course I know Slavoj Žižek really well, and they're both they're not sanguine about elections, but I believe in like I was really heartened by back when it happened, like Madero's election, Lula's election, so a lot of, so the experience of South America was really important for me, just theoretically, to think about the way in which the vote can matter. And I guess it's also hard for me when I think what people have on the left who sacrificed so that everyone can vote. It a little bit bothers me to have to disparage it so much. But I see the point, of course. I'm not an idiot. I see the way in which the vote can be used to stop some kind of spirit of change. But on the other hand, like, look at the way in which Trump is so terrified of the vote, right? He's terrified of how the vote will turn out. And I think that just shows there is this radical potential in the vote to express something of some kind of, spirit of the people that otherwise wouldn't get expressed.
Yeah, I vote as well. I know Tomas votes as well. I think Tomas might even end up running for political office.
Yeah.
No, I'm totally for that, by the way. I don't like this position that's always critical, but it refuses to take power, because I think that's such an easy position for the left to adopt. This, we're always
the beautiful soul.
We're always resisting. But I just say, like, be willing to take power and take charge and see what happens, right? Like, I think that's absolute. So I think of it as like the Star Wars phenomenon. Like, we're always on the side of the rebels. We're never on the side of the empire. But, let's be on the side of the team that's ruling, and let's see what we do. I feel like that's worth doing.
Yeah. Exactly.
On that,
I completely agree.
Go ahead, Tomas.
That's why I might try running for office, like Nicholas says.
Support Tomas, Team Tomas. But yeah, because, and I asked that also, to get into another topic, which is that we've seen this new, obscene leaders who destroy their own dignity and have more power, Trump, Bolsonaro, and so on. But we also are seeing the rise of even this new sort of, this response to that, this Ocasio-Cortez and Prime Minister of New Zealand, I forget her name. And it's happening in, Anglo-speaking countries, What's happening there? For me, it's something new. Like, we haven't seen this before. It's a product of the 21st century, whatever we call this, but it's something new. What do you think, guys?
Well, I think that, Ocasio-Cortez is I think a great figure. And I feel like it's interesting to think about figures like her, as you're pointing out, Nicholas, like in response to the obscenity of, so it's interesting, first of all, how the obscene leader has become the dominant leader today, right? Like, it's not just Trump, Bolsonaro, Putin, Modi. They're they're everywhere, right? Most of the world's population right now is controlled by an obscene leader, which is fascinating to think about and horrifying. And so I think, one of the things that this new left is bringing is a kind of decency. And I find this pretty fascinating that the left is becoming the figures of decency and the right is the figures of obscenity, which is a total reversal of the way, like, say, it worked out in the 60s, right? Like the whole point of the left is to say anything. And, this slogan in France, jouir sans entrave, enjoy without any limits. And they used to say, we're going to fuck our mothers, there's no limit on my enjoyment. And I think there's this is interesting because psychoanalysis there's this contemporary sense that psychoanalysis has something to say politically. And I think one of the ideas of psychoanalysis is that there's no unlimited enjoyment. There's no jouir sans entrave. There's no enjoyment without limits. And I think that's what this new version of the left is saying. It's saying, let's limit let's be in favor of certain limits, and not this enjoyment with this obscene enjoyment without limits. So, and I think Ocasio-Cortez embodies this. So I feel like this is I think it's a left that's able to take power, which relates to what we were just saying before, and it's a left that's no longer just hysterical. Its response to everything isn't hysteria. And I think that traditionally that's been the problem with the left, is it's had a hysterical response to every kind of exertion of power, right? And I think we're finally seeing a left that maybe can rule and can institute some kind of its own form of an order.
Okay.
Todd, but let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
How do you think the left can be on the side of decency, and on the side on the side of prohibition, if father doesn't? You yourself said in one of your books that basically the father figure doesn't work like before. So now we have that's also one of the points that Slavoj makes, that we today we have the postmodern father who doesn't put limits on enjoyment, and who actually forces you to enjoy, which is basically one of the main problems of our day, that we are forced to enjoy and therefore we cannot properly enjoy. But so if we don't have the old father who says no, how can the left be on the side, and successfully on the side, of prohibition?
Great question. And I just want to say, I loved what you said, because, I see Trump as a figure of superego. Like Lacan's idea of the superego is the superego commands enjoyment. And this is what Trump does. But Tomas, your point is great, that's the only way not to enjoy. You get commanded to enjoy. That's a sure way not to be able to enjoy, right? Here's what I would say. I think you're right that the old system of prohibition is gone, and I think it's gone for good, and probably it's good that it's gone. But I think that this opens up this notion of a self-limitation, and I think that's what the left is now in the process of working out. This idea of the limitation isn't this external thing imposed on us, but we limit ourselves in a certain way. And I feel like I almost think that's the difference between today, the left and the right. The right is this refusal of the limit, and it's tied to capitalism, capitalism, absolute rejection of limits, right? And I think the left is this idea of a self-limitation. And I think one of the reasons for the failures of the leftist projects of the 20th century was the refusal of limitation. Like this idea that we can do everything. We can, that's the Stalinist idea. We can create a new person, right? We can create something out of whole cloth, and a rejection of the limit. And I think the notion that we necessarily produce the limit out of ourselves, that seems like to me an alternative to prohibition of the father.
So it's like a new Socratic project. Do you know what Nietzsche accuses Socrates of in the Twilight of the Idols? He says that Socrates said to Athenian nobles, "Hey, you should be masters of your own selves. You should put limits on your own desires. You should be moderate, just, etc. And so, if I understood correctly what you've just said, basically the role of the left is a bit Socratic in this sense of not saying to the Athenian nobles, but to everyone, hey, just try to try to rein your desires, try to put limits on what you want. Is that
Right.
correct?
Yeah, correct. Except in this sense, right? Like the limit isn't an external thing you have to like. If otherwise, my desire would be unlimited. No, the limit actually is what constitutes my desire. So I think that's the recognition that it's not we have to accept a limit. Oh no, it's terrible. We have to accept this limit. We can't get everything we want. No, it's that the limit actually constitutes our desire and what we want. So to recognize really the limit as essential to who we are and to what we and to our ability to even desire at all. So the rejection of this idea that we can have everything. So rejection of the American project in that sense.
But it's beautiful because there's what I get is a freedom in decency, self-limit. And is there any part of this that can be attributed to the feminine dimension? Because I mean, for example, Hacintardum and AOC, yes, they're very decent people and so on, but they're also I think she took her baby and breastfed in the United Nations, and AOC is giving beauty tips and so on, and in a way, because they're women, I don't know if that sort of helps to yes, we're decent, we're also free, and the limit is ours and not externally imposed. I don't know if that's got something to do with it.
Well, what do you think, Nicholas? What do you think that their femininity has to do with it? I mean, I'm not. Maybe it does. It's not clear to me. What?
Because it to me it's it stands out that this the Latin America, we have this decent left, but they were mostly men. And in the Anglo world, we're getting women. And, for me, it's new in that respect. Because, yes, there's freedom, and there's decency, and there's self-limits, but it's a new sort of, leader. And, Latin American left is still, I think, caught in the patriarchy sort of thing. I don't know how to call it. External superego, basically. Yeah.
Right. I do think, go ahead.
And yeah, this is happening in the nucleus of modernity. So for me, that's interesting.
Yeah, I do think that isn't it true that feminine sexuality has a different relationship to limit than, masculine sexuality is all about transcending any kind of limit. Like it's modeled on this figure of the primal father that accepts no limit at all, right? That's the masculine ideal. Femininity doesn't have an ideal like that at all. So the limit is more, it's internal to the very conception, I think, of feminine sexuality. So I think that makes a lot of sense that they would be the figures of this new kind of self-limiting left or self-limiting kind of emancipation, right? That's how I think of it. I think of it as emancipation through self-limitation rather than this notion of emancipation by transcending every limit.
Now that you guys are talking about this, I remembered one of Slavoy's points in which he argues that for Marx, communism was sort of a capitalism without contradictions. And because capitalism is always expanding and producing desire without limits, communism would also entail a sort of how to call it, limitlessness, or like this constant infinite expansion, and not only in the realm of material goods, but also in the realm of desire. Because like Todd was saying, not only in the 60s, but like in Marx himself, there's a notion of communism like a state of affairs in which we can get everything that we desire. And that's what 20th century communists promised a superabundance. You're gonna get what your heart desires, no castration at all.
Right.
And and so, of course, from a psychoanalytical perspective, that's very problematic. And so I'd like to ask Todd if he thinks that this new left, which promises limits, is in a sense more psychoanalytic than the old left, or if you may not agree with what Slavoj says. I don't know. What do you think, Todd?
I think that's absolutely correct. And I think that isn't the exemplar of what you're describing that passage in German Ideology where he says you can be a hunter in the morning, a critic
exactly.
in the afternoon. Yeah. So that I think you're right that it doesn't just apply to economics, but it applies to your everyday life, that it's a non-castrated life that Marx believes in, which is odd because Hegel is, before Freud, the great philosopher of the necessity of castration. So it's a real, I think, departure from Hegel by Marx on that issue, which is too bad, because I think you could make the argument that theoretical error by Marx led to all the practical errors by 20th century communists that produced a lot of death. And so I feel like it's unfair on one level to blame Marx for Stalin, but I think in another sense, like this notion of an uncastrated ideal is at the essence of Stalinism. So today,
be right back. Sorry.
So I'll answer his question while he's gone, so that way. But I feel like it is. I do believe that it's a psychoanalytic left, and so I think it's important that Slavoj is one of the chief. He's not necessarily attached. I don't know if Ocasio-Cortez even knows who Slavoj is, but I think there is an alignment between the certain psychoanalytic politics and the form that the new left is taking. So I think there is a real connection. What's interesting is I'm not sure if there are actual connections. Like I'm not sure if these leftists are actually attached to different psychoanalytic thinkers. I think sometimes maybe they are, but not as much as in the 60s, right? Like Lacan's students were all the people that were out, all the Maoists demonstrating in the streets were all Lacanian students, right? So
right.
There was a much closer tie then, but the movement was very anti-psychoanalytic, I think. And Lacan was critical of it. Like he was very critical of the May 68 students. And I think, but I think today it's totally different. I think it's really, I think there's again, I'll just say it, I think it's important that figures like Slavoj Žižek are the most, he's one of the most well-known political theorists today, I think because of the way in which his thought lines up with what the left is doing and how it's considering itself.
Sorry guys to interrupt you, but sorry Nicholas, but I have to go because a technician came and he's gonna fix something at my apartment. And I prefer not to, but I have to go. So I'm very sorry. You know how these guys are; they come just at any hour. So
it's good to see that that's the same all around the world, because here,
exactly.
To give you a window, we'll come between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. So just make sure.
Exactly. So I'm very sorry, but. It's been great talking to you guys, and I hope we can talk again soon.
See you soon, Tomas.
Right.
Bye.
Thanks for being on. Yeah, just with what you're saying, Todd. Now I think I can answer the question about the feminine aspect, because Freud, as the, let's say, great the guy who feared human desire, an advocate of castration, I think that's still in culture, basically. So when you get the left, especially, you get this whole, will they take power or anything that's not establishment, Trump, whatever's, where will they stop?
Yeah.
And with this new feminine, leaders, that doesn't apply. Like, regardless of their relation to their desire, nobody fears, how far they're going to go. Like, nobody's really wondering, will they be? And I think there's something there, because they openly, in a way, admit their desire, I guess, but nonetheless, we don't fear their desire. So,
no, I love that point, and I think it even explains this weird phenomenon in the United States where there's this fear of Bernie Sanders and how far he'll go. He'll take away everything. But about AOC, there's a kind of horror about her on the right, but there isn't the same kind of fear that she'll go too far. So I think it really speaks to what you're saying, that it doesn't evoke, which maybe gives them more of a political chance, right? Like it doesn't. Yeah, I think that's right. I like that idea a lot.
Yeah, because ultimately that's, I want to ask you that. What are the chances of anything interesting happening? I mean, I think there are interesting times in the US. And, these repressed things are coming out. So what do you like? But it's also a really uncertain time, I think. What do you think can happen or will happen or,
Well, I mean, I think it is I think there is moments of possibility now, especially because, Biden, he's a very moderate guy, right? But a lot of what his platform does is Bernie has kind of got it in there. And it's interesting that Trump has articulated this fear, like he's just a puppet of the radical left. And I think Trump says that, I say, I hope so. I hope that's true. And I kind of think it is maybe true. I feel like and I think this is true in Germany and other places around the world, that it's really on the issue of environment and the ecological catastrophe that the whole question is going to be resolved, I think. Like, are we going to respond to that in the way that's necessary? And if we do, I think it will require some kind of socialistic and whole world connected response. And it can't just be a capitalist answer, because I think that is no answer. So I think I think the answer will be some way green, or it will be disaster. So I feel like that's really the issue on which the whole question turns in my mind. Like, to what extent we respond to that crisis. And I think, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that the U.S. is going to lead the world. That's the other thing. And I'm not sure that that's bad. I mean, I feel like Trump's election has marginalized the U.S. in a way that's maybe good. Like the U.S. was always this world leader. And I think, not necessarily for the good. The only problem is, of course, if China steps into that role, it seems to me worse. So there is this, like, it's not clear to me. And hopefully maybe we can have a world where no country is leading. That would be maybe the ideal. But I think it matters what comes next, because I think Trump has maybe put an end to the American century because he's pulled troops from Europe. He's done just the way in which he's brought American power, reined it in, and not, and also not launched any wars, unlike his predecessors. So there is this way in which, for the rest of the world, other than on the question of environment, which has been terrible, but for the rest of the world, I think Trump has been not bad, right? Like, if you compared Trump to Bush, there's just no question. Like, Bush is far worse.
Or Hillary. Yeah. But the thing with China for me is, like, I don't think anybody should be too afraid about a Chinese aggression. But if the Chinese, common sense does, begin to spread, for me, China is the centrist dream. Technocracy, apolitical, and completely cynical. For me, it's a huge danger, because it's some sort of regression to pre-modern times with, postmodern technology. I'm not sure that there's emancipation, or I doubt that there's any emancipation in the China.
No, I totally agree with that, and I think you're right to say it would be the victory of cynicism over the possibility of emancipation. That's what I think. If we had a Chinese rule in the world, that would be exactly what it is. And to me, that's a frightening, maybe the most frightening future.
Is there any place that you sort of think, is currently leading, or some sort of place where there's very interesting thoughts or political action or movements or...
Well, I think there are everywhere. I think certainly in South America, there's this. You've been the leader on the globe for a while in terms of emancipative projects. But I think in India too, there's a lot of interesting. I feel like around the world there are these, AOC here. I think Bernie here in Vermont. I feel like there's this. But the problem is, of course, I almost think it's a battle between obscenity and decency, and it's like, which form, and can the decency break away enough from capitalism to attract the masses to it in order to prevail? I think that's the question, really. Like, I don't think it can be, as long as it remains a capitalist decency, I think it will. I think the obscenity will always win out, and I think so. So I fear that's. I guess that's my feeling. Like, if this classic thing, like socialism or barbarism. I think we're really confronted with that alternative now, even more than people were when they formed that group, socialism or barbarism. Like, I feel like it's really now we see, like, Trump just embodies the horror of that barbaric alternative, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's just it's hard to be optimistic and keep faith, and we should, and everyone should, of course. But we had those movements here, and we had the revolutions, and they were peaceful and electoral and so on, and they don't stick, and that's worrying, at least for me, because since then I've had to turn to actual, therapy or other schools of thought, even, Reich, Gestalt, and so on.
Yeah.
Because I'm seeing that, there can be the political structure even for emancipation, but if there's not something that, it's the individual also that needs to take care of its own, especially in these countries, where we expect, some superior structure to come and get us out of our troubles. But yeah, it's there, and I think there's even a path, but people just don't seem to want to, embrace liberty and embrace their own, self limits, but also, their life.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right that there it can't just be a political solution, that it has to be an individual psyche act as well. And I think that's why, most of the people I know that are the most engaged in leftist politics, their own lives are so filled with, like, the worst kind of things, so I'm like, I'm not sure that I want you ruling if you come into power. So I really feel this thing that what you're saying, that you have to also take care of your own psychic struggle, and emancipation, I think it's first psychic, and then the political is attached to it. But I don't think you could be rescued from afar. Like, you have to really, and I think, if anything, I feel like the dissemination of psychoanalysis, not just as a practice, but as a way of thinking, I feel like that's really been important. And I think that is as important as any kind of large scale leftist project that we can think of. I really believe that. I think that just, just so far as just what we were talking about, like the notion of accepting your castration, like, if that, I was at a conference, and some the speaker was talking about racism and psychoanalysis, and someone raised their hand. They're like, well, what advice would you, the speaker was black and the respondent was white, and he goes, what advice would you have for a white man struggling with the questions of race and racism? And the speaker said, accept your lack. That's all he said. And I thought, that's pretty great, right? Like, that's really where the emancipatory question is really felt, right? And I think you can't think that the political is going to rescue you from that problem, the problem of your own psychic struggle and lack.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, even the lesson of the Soviet Union, right? So you have Lenin, you have this great leader, and what does the common man do? Common man speaking, as, not pejoratively, but they go for Stalin.
Yeah.
Or we did. I'm not. Whatever the.
Yeah. No, I think there's always something appealing about a Stalinist figure, because it's the master who rescues you from your, you can. What's interesting about that figure is you can be lacking, but you're assured that there is at least someone else who's not. And I think that's the thing that's even more difficult to get over, right? Like, you can be poor and white and struggling, but as long as there's this figure up there who's not lacking, I can feel, who doesn't accept any limits, right? Then I can feel like it's all okay.
So you're an optimist.
I think I am. Against myself, I am. Yeah, because I feel like, precisely for this, what we just talked about, that I think this emancipation on an individual level. I think that, look, you can't obviously. I think you have to think like the larger structure. What I can do is work on my own emancipation, and then that means, of course, you're involved in the larger structure and you're involved in other struggles. But you have to. That's the thing that you have to live with day in and day out, I think, and that's I guess for that reason I'm optimistic. Just because I guess for me, like I started out, I grew up as a fundamentalist religious conservative, and so now I'm a leftist whatever and theorist, and I mean just that trajectory that I had, it's just amazing. So I guess I feel like that kind of. There's always this possibility for this radical emancipation, and I guess that's what makes me more optimistic than not.
That's a beautiful note to end the show on. Yeah, therapeutic or therapeutic. I don't know how you say it, but healing for sure. Thank you, Todd. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Nicholas. I love my friend. It was great to talk to you as always.
Thank you, Todd. Very pleased, very honored, and thank you. I'll stop recording now and say goodbye.
Okay.